A lot of the time they have weren't able to fit in, but nonetheless, we have here, we're doing questions and answers. But I actually wanted to go ahead and introduce, we got, many of you people, all the different chapels of the Resistance, actually there's a representative of most of our chapels here, actually, some representatives of most of our chapels, and so it's good to have you here. And also remember this purpose of this event, strengthen the faith. Try to pull our people together in the faith. And remember, we're in a global fight for the faith. So that's why we have Father Raphael from South America. And also we have Greg Taylor coming over from England, who's helped coordinate our work in England. We have about, how many places we say in Mass in England now?
4 or 5 in the Southern.
4 or 5, there's about 10 altogether. About 10 altogether, and we say Mass in about 5 regular places. And Father King helps us and covers the places, and some places we used to Liverpool and Scotland, and then we have each year actually Greg Taylor comes over here for a week during his time, and he teaches Latin in the oratory. In the oratory in England, it's a famous school in England, boys' school, and in the Catholic school, teaches Latin there, and then. Once a year during this break, he comes over and actually teaches a week of history to our seminarians. Just kind of fill in some various aspects or gaps of history. And so it usually comes towards the beginning of the year and gives 1 week of classes. We have sometimes people come in and help out here or there with various aspects. History is one of the strengths. And so in any case, also he teaches Latin during that week as well, covers our Latin classes as well, he's a Latin professor. And so I have Greg's got a few minutes here. Greg give a few minute talk to kind of get one half of the we're in a battle of civilization, and that one point I forgot to mention in my little talk is that there's only one man. I'll just put it here in 2 seconds. Okay, that's all right. Put it here in 2 seconds. It's only one world, and we're fighting the whole battle of civilization. This is kind of the point. There's only one Catholic worldview. And we consider this politics, economics, where are we? Economics, and monastics. What are these things? The devil is cut apart. Okay. But the devil has cut these things apart. We've got to put them back together. You see, there's sciences: politics, economics, and monastics. They're all one. There are 3 different sciences, 3 different, but they're one life. And one thing the devil has really separated is political life. That's for politicians. Economic life, everybody has to deal with that because it has to do with money. And monastics is spiritual. But in fact, I am one human being. Every human being, every man, he is a part of the police, especially nowadays. Usually the police is a rock group, or it's the people that you meet everywhere you go. The polis is the city. The economics is the family. And monastics is the individual. And these 3 are one. I am one person that has individual part of it. I have to live as an individual inside the family, inside of the city. And now these things have been ripped apart. The whole of civilization has been ripped apart. So I'm Greg just give a few minutes here, just a few minutes before we go over to the questions and answers with Father, all of us. And just to kind of give the other half of what Father Hugo gave the talk on the civilization, kind of the New Testament. And then Greg's going to try to cover some of the Old Testament aspect of it. And so I'll hand over the floor here, but I've got to mention that we're one. Politics, economics, and monastics. The political life, the economic life, and the monastic life. Okay. So in any case, we'll go ahead and... What? Quiet. Please let me... Okay. Now, okay, all right. So in any case, as I'll hand over the floor for a few minutes to Greg Taylor. And also, many of you may not know, Greg Taylor, of course, he has the magazine that he produces in England, the Rakusan. And of course he does come here each year, but usually only the seminarians see him, because it's just during the week, and it's teaching of classes for a week. And they sometimes come later in the year for a second week of classes, sometimes, but usually not here on weekends, or because usually they get back to England for their other classes. But in any case, it's good to have Greg. I'll hand on the floor to Greg for a few minutes, and then we're going to, and when he gets tired, I'm going to throw him off the floor, and then it could be a little sentence, and then we'll take over questions and answers. So theoretically, 15-20 minutes to try to fill in the other half of what Father was covering.
Thank you. I will try not to try your patience too much.
Better on the other side.
Sorry. Those of you who have endured one of my talks before will be pleased to know that Bishop Williamson doesn't feature at all in this. Okay. A quick history lesson. The challenge for me is to condense it into 20 minutes. As Father Farquhar won't let me talk for any longer than that. I could easily talk for about 20 hours about what I'm going to say. And it's what I wanted to briefly go over is the excellent sort of schema snapshot that Father Hugo did earlier on. What came before that? And in particular the Dark Ages, who nobody seems to know anything about. And very briefly, and I have to simplify this a lot, but very briefly, if you look at it, it goes in 3 stages. By Rome, I mean classical Rome. And
He says the other black one's better.
oh, okay. From classical Rome, becoming Catholic, through the Emperor Constantine, as Father Raphael said. Constantine, by the way, as you know, came from York. He wouldn't have described himself as English, he would have described himself as a Roman. Because the curious thing is, every time the Romans went somewhere and brought civilization to a new country and co-opted a new people into the Roman Empire, within a very short period of time, those people would have described themselves as Roman. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul roughly, 50 odd years before our Lord, something like that, and probably by about the end of the 1st century AD, if you'd spoken to one of those people, they wouldn't have said, I'm a Gaul, they would have said, I'm a Roman. AD 54, the Emperor Claudius launched the proper invasion of Britain, and Britain became a Roman province. And for a very short period of time, there were 2 tiers in society. There were the Romans, who were the conquerors, and the native Britons, who were the underclass. And probably within 100, certainly not more than 200 years later, if you had spoken to somebody from Britain, you would have said, I'm a Roman. If you'd spoken to somebody from Spain, you would have said, I'm a Roman. From Italy, Dalmatia, any of the Panoia, Noricum, Romania, which still a country which still has the name to this day, and of course the east of the empire, the Levant, Syria, Palestine, all of that area, Egypt and North Africa. So the Romans had a certain national character, a certain spirit, and we do well to look at them and study them and learn a little bit about Roman history, because this is where civilization came from. It was pagan. The church took it and took the good bits, and when this particular civilization declined, as all civilizations do, the church kept the good bits, and it sort of went into a cocoon, and it stayed there for a few hundred years, and then it blossomed out again into the Middle Ages. But there was a continuity. There is a permanent thread running through it. We don't know very much about the Dark Ages. What we do know, I will discuss very briefly in a moment, and of course from there we come to the Middle Ages. We can't understand the Middle Ages or how they came about or anything like that until we understand the Dark Ages. In history you can never really understand anything unless you understand what came before. And we can't understand the Dark Ages unless we understand the Romans. Very quickly, and I'm trying to rush through this. Who were the Romans? If you want to look at a national character and get just a brief glimpse, a snapshot into how a people, a nation, a race, a country, how they see themselves, and it's not an accurate picture, you can look at great men from history who they themselves held up as an example. Protestant England with all its faults and failings, not modern England, which is, modern England is a mess. Half of them are Muslims, half the other half are liberals. But England, when it was before the modern age, in the middle of London in Trafalgar Square, on top of an enormous great big tall column, there is set in stone the figure of Horatio Nelson. And if you want to know how the Victorians even pre-Victorian Englishmen thought of themselves, well, they held up this great man as an example, and every English schoolboy knew the story of Nelson, how he died winning the Battle of Trafalgar, and how at the Battle of Cape St Vincent he was given the order to retreat, and he deliberately put the telescope to his blind eye and said, no, I can't see that order, and went straight ahead into the French and won the battle, all that kind of thing. This is clearly somebody that my ancestors admired for various reasons, and it gives you a little insight into how they saw themselves. This is our role model, this is how we should be like. Now, Roman history, there are various examples we can look at. Horatio defending the bridge against an entire army over the river Tiber, and he stopped Rome from being captured by fighting them on that narrow bottleneck of the bridge, and meanwhile his friends were destroying the bridge behind him while he held the enemy off, and then they jumped into the river and swam back. They admired this very much. I'll give another example. Cincinnatus, who was a retired Roman general, and he retired and went to farm a small plot of land and be basically a poor peasant farmer. And in the moment of crisis, when Rome was invaded, Rome was surrounded, Rome was under siege, the Roman army had been led out by an incompetent general and cut off and trapped on a hill, and everything looked lost, and the senators came to Cincinnatus and they said, you're the only man who can save our country. And he said, okay. And he came out of retirement and took command, and they voted him all power. They gave him the position of dictator, which was an official position within the Roman constitution. He was the dictator, and he defeated the enemy, saved Rome, saved his country, and he had all the power and all the glory, and he could have done anything he wanted to. And at that point in his career he said, well, my work is done, handed back all the power, changed from his toga back into his shabby work clothes, and went back to farming his little farm. And the Romans admired that very much. They're stoic, they're serious. You have only to look at the statues that we have of Romans. They don't pull funny faces and stick their tongues out, and they're not frivolous and flippant like we are today. They don't wear their heart on their sleeve, but their actions echo down the centuries. Now, God used the Roman Empire, and when it became Catholic, which it did in fits and starts, as you know, the Catholics were persecuted, and then there'd be sort of an amnesty and a period of peace, then they'd be persecuted again. There were various persecutions each time the church grew stronger, until you get to the age of Constantine. And then just when the Roman Empire becomes officially Catholic and everything looks wonderful, Arianism comes and threatens to destroy everything. I'm glossing over a huge amount of history that deserves to be looked at more closely. The Roman Empire went into decline. I'm talking 300-400 years after Christ. There is a Protestant myth, and it's a lie. It comes from Victorian Englishmen. English historians from the sort of mid to late 19th century came up with this lie for their own purposes, for the purpose of glorifying Protestantism by retroactively reading into history. I could explain it in more detail later. And the lie is called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's not true. The Roman Empire declined, it never fell. And this is very important that we understand this. I'm going to just mention him now so I don't forget. There's one book which you must read if you want to understand this at all. Some of you will know Hilaire Belloc, and the book is called Europe and Faith. And the opening words are, his opening words are, the faith is Europe and Europe is the faith. He means Europe meaning civilization. Everything that we have that is in the civilized world, in the Catholic world, if you look, it comes from Europe. And even an atheist historian, if he's honest and he has an honest, relatively balanced view of it, or at least a bit of an open mind, and he looks back at history, he must surely say to himself, there is something unusual about Europe. It's the smallest continent in the world, and yet it's the continent that made the most progress and went out sent people out to Africa, to the Americas, and everywhere else. Why Europe? Now, it is not a coincidence, and we know the answer why. Why did civilization come first from Europe? The Roman Empire declined. It went into decline. All that means is that the taxes were being collected less frequently, the roads were being repaired less frequently, and the central government in Rome wasn't sending out orders to the provinces as frequently as it should, and this process went on and got worse and worse, and eventually the little areas where you had a governor of this area or that area of the Roman Empire, they started taking their own initiative naturally, and eventually over the course of a few hundred years you get these different little kingdoms. Not even France, Spain and Britain, but within Spain several little kingdoms, within France several kingdoms, and in England as well. Now the Dark Ages, I think Father Hugo said the Middle Ages originally that the term was an insult. The Dark Ages is an insult today, but originally the term was not an insult. It's dark for one reason. History is the very novel idea that you write down what is happening so that people in the future can know what happened. Now it seems obvious to us, but presumably at some point it never really occurred to anybody to do it. The man known as the father of history is a writer called Herodotus, and he's a Greek. He's 500 plus years before our Lord, and he really is just telling stories. The word history and the word story are from the same etymological root. It's historia in Greek. It means a story, or it means history. You're just saying, here's what happened, and you're telling the story. Now, so we don't know, for example, much about the world before the time of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The oldest piece of literature, even older than Homer, that is extant, I gather, is a thing called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's around the central column of the temple in Ur, Ur, which I'm sure you'll remember is the city that Abraham originally came from. Again, I'm sure it's not a coincidence. But to get back to the Dark Ages, why are they dark? For a historian, looking back, there is not a lot of history. There aren't that many sources. You look for somebody in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries saying, okay, this is what happens, this is what I saw happening today. There are no sources. Nobody's doing that. Why are they not doing that? Because they were too busy doing other things. And what were they busy doing? They were busy fighting. Sorry, Father. They were busy fighting, and I do actually think as well there's a lot of truth in the saying that if you're busy talking about something, it's because you're not busy doing it. There's this awful saying about jaw and not war, and these chaps didn't do a lot of jaw because they were all about war. That's all they did. They fought. They practically lived with their sword in their hand and slept with it. This is my not very good map of Europe. There we are. There's Italy. This is worth your patience. Greece, Turkey, Egypt, etc. That's North Africa. Okay, there we are. Now the Roman Empire, if you look at it, it was pretty much stretched around the Mediterranean. Rome is kind of halfway down on the left here in Italy. And really Britain was the outlying province. It's all the way up there. 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, we see that there's just fighting everywhere. The central government has broken down. People are taking their own initiatives in the provinces. They are still Roman. And it's very important that we realise that. They still speak Latin, read Latin, write Latin. They think of themselves as Roman. The central bureaucracy, the machinery of government, is slowly falling apart and no longer working, but that's the decline of the Roman Empire. It didn't fall. It was invaded, and it did fight. 3 principal areas. Here, now the boundary of the Roman Empire, it went backwards and forwards, but basically it was the River Rhine in Germany. So Gaul was sort of France and a bit of Germany. And the Germans would periodically come over, raiding parties would come over. They did not think of themselves as attacking the Roman Empire. It would never have occurred to them any more than it would have occurred to them that you could attack bread and cheese or fresh air. I'm using Hilaire Belloc's analogy because in the world at that time there was civilization and then there was outside of civilization. You can't make war on civilization. They plundered, they looted, sometimes they would get inside the boundaries and then they would settle down. They just wanted a piece of the prosperity, they wanted to be part of it very often. But it was a continual problem and it started happening more and more as the machinery of the Roman Empire broke down. The troops were withdrawn from Britain to fight elsewhere in the empire in the year 410. And from that, the Protestant historians tell us that the Romans left Britain in 410. It's a nonsense because the people were Roman. 400 years of being part of the Roman Empire, there was no more distinction between Roman and Britain anymore. The troops were moved out, they didn't come back. And what happened was small boats of probably Germanic, Norwegian, Scandinavian, we don't really know who they were. They've gone down in history with such names as the Jutes and the Saxons, but these are the names of tribes, and we don't know a great deal about them, but they basically settled along the southern and eastern coast. They started raiding, but eventually they just settled down there, and so Britain ended up divided into the sort of Roman British who were in the centre and west of the country, and just the eastern coastal strip and the south was these new Germanic settlers who were pagans. By the 5th century, most of the Britons were Catholic. You had raiding going on here, across from Germany, and a new religion which spread like wildfire all the way across North Africa, up through Spain, and up into France, where it was turned back eventually by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. And of course, you know that the religion I'm referring to is Islam. So when we get to, there was one point in fact where one of the kings in England, Roman British kings, a Catholic as well, King Alfred the Great, was in hiding because of his war against the pagan Germans, and civilization was teetering in the balance in Britain. At the same time, it looked like the Muslims were at the gates of Paris. Civilization was teetering on the brink here as well. They not only, Islam took over all of North Africa, but it also made various raids and even managed to get a toehold in parts of Italy, Sicily and so on. So effectively what happened, by about the 8th, 9th, 10th century AD, the geography, you can just see at a glance even from my very badly drawn map, the balance shifted. Rome effectively became a frontline city. And the centre of gravity shifted and was now Gaul. Years, and I mean centuries of hard fighting, and eventually the Muslims, Islam was pushed back through France, across the Pyrenees, back through Spain, and it was finally driven out in the year 1492. The same year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue was the year that Ferdinand and Isabella finally managed to drive the Sultan out of Granada. In fact, you can still go there to this day and see the Alhambra Palace where he lived, and the Generalife, which is the beautiful gardens there. It's a museum. They were expelled, but it took years and years and years of long fighting without let-up. And here, St. Augustine was sent by Pope St. Gregory the Great to reconnect Britain to the rest of Christendom, because it had been cut off, accidentally almost, but because they settled along the coast, you couldn't get over from France into Britain anymore. And so that these two parts of the Roman Empire were effectively cut off. So, and St. Augustine landed in Kent, here. And by a complete accident of history, the bishops who were already there, the sort of Romano-British bishops in the centre and west of the country, were not very well behaved. They were not very kind to St. Augustine. They weren't really very helpful. So he said, fine, I don't need you. And he converted the local king in Kent, a man called King Ethelbert, who is now known to us as Saint Ethelbert, because he became a saint. He converted, his kingdom converted, and that then became the vehicle for St. Augustine to re-evangelise and reconnect to the church all the rest of the country, and which is why, incidentally, the language English It has more sort of, the upper layer of it is more Germanic. It's a complete accident of history. It should have been a Romance language, same as French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, but because of this it isn't. It's got kind of Latin underneath it, but the upper layers, the topsoil as it were, it is more sort of Germanic because of this. So civilization teetered on the brink, but eventually it was won back for Christendom, and here of course many of you will be familiar with Karl der Große, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, who pushed effectively the boundary of civilization much further. Hilaire Belloc would say it was a valiant effort and it didn't last, because of course these areas here later would become Protestant. Now, because of all those years of fighting, not very much was being written down, so we don't know a great deal about it. That is one of the reasons that the Protestant historians have been able to say, they've been able to talk about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. They do that because they want to, as I say, read backwards into history, and their argument is, you see, this was inevitable, the Protestant Reformation was foretold, the disciplined, blonde, blue-eyed, Germanic northern hordes invaded and completely crushed the swarthy Mediterranean superstitious peoples of the south, and it's meant to be like a metaphor for the Reformation 1,000 years later. It's complete nonsense. Nothing of the sort ever took place. But in the meantime, who was keeping reading and writing alive? Really, it was the monasteries. So the Benedictine order, really, thanks to the Benedictine order, we owe civilization to the Benedictines, who incidentally also invented written music, so we owe music to them. All the good bits of the Roman Empire were preserved. And obviously the bad bits can be discarded. I said God used the Roman Empire as his instrument. He did. He also used Alexander the Great 300 years before Christ as his instrument, which is why the Gospels are written in Greek, because Alexander the Great passed through and conquered the whole known world and left a legacy of the Greek language and Greek literature, meaning that the Gospels could be written in Greek and then understood all over the civilized world. And 5 minutes, okay. What can I leave you with? Right, this is the point then. So, when we talk about the Catholic faith, as Father Pfeiffer said earlier on, we are talking about civilization. There is a temptation to see the battle that we're in as being one of narrow interests. This is my version of religion, and I don't care for your version of religion. Mine is superior, and it's been whittled away now to the point where you've got the remnant of the remnant of the remnant of the remnant of the remnant. You're doing this to save your soul, yes, but you are also doing it for civilization. The two are not different, they are the same thing, and as, again, sort of as Father said earlier on, you have to see it as part of one complete whole. History is a seamless garment. It's not chopped up into little bits. It's one event almost, and God is completely in control of it, and even the bad parts serve a good end in the end, so to speak. And furthermore, please consider the fact that if you were alive in, let's say, the year 550 or 600 AD, all you would have seen was the Roman Empire, which had then become Catholic, wearing out, declining, being invaded, being overrun on all sides, and it was all hands to the pump, and civilization was fighting a desperate rearguard action. Those people alive then could never have imagined for one moment the Middle Ages. In other words, nobody came, an angel from heaven didn't come down to them and say, you've got to do this because 500 years from now there'll be a pope called St. Gregory the Seventh, and there'll be this crusade, and then the Normans will come along. They didn't know that. They didn't know that, but we owe everything to them. If they hadn't kept fighting, well, civilization would have come to an end. But again, you see the hand of God in that, because this was not allowed to happen. So this wasn't allowed to happen. Father Huco's schema sort of showed a decline, as it were, like this. If you look from, let's say, the time of our Lord through to about 1000 AD, you'd see sort of the Roman Empire declining and the Catholic Church doing that at the same time. Until here, you get to the Middle Ages. And this is the sort of Dark Ages in between. What's going on now is we are seeing a decline in the faith, so to speak. We know that that will lead to a decline in civilization, but we also know, number one, God is in charge of everything. We also know that the enemy thinks in terms of centuries. He doesn't think from 1 week to the next, or even from 1 year to the next, and we have to see ourselves in this context. You keeping the faith means you are going to save your soul, but also you save your soul by doing everything you can to help everybody else save theirs, even if you're a layman. But also you're doing a service to civilization, if that sort of makes sense. You are preserving Christendom and what is left of it. I could say a whole lot more, but I don't want to try your patience.
You already did.
Okay.
Okay, that's good.
How would you like to proceed?
No, that's good. No, we'll switch over to the. Well, actually, one thing that's the prophecy of one little point there, just to add to it. The prophecy of Daniel. He says that they're the civilization of. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream in chapter 9, I think, of the book of Daniel, and he saw the whole rest of history, in which there would be a statue with a golden head, and then bronze, and then silver neck, bronze chest, and then lead, then turning to clay. And in that statue was all civilizations, said Daniel, till the end of time. The iron turning lead to clay. And the iron civilization was Rome. And that the prophecy is that this last civilization would be Rome until a little pebble would hit the foot of the statue and break it and replace it. And so the Fathers of the Church tell us that the last civilization is the Roman civilization. And that when the Antichrist comes, it'll be the 10 heads, right? I think, I'm forgetting on the book of Apocalypse. 10 heads, which will be a breaking of 10 great, the Roman civilization will break down to 10 heads. And that these 10 heads will then rise up and unite themselves behind the Antichrist. So that according to the prophecy of Daniel, the Roman civilization is the last civilization. St. Basil says that the Rome didn't fall, but that we woke up, Rome was a persecutor of the church, Rome was trying to destroy the church, and then one day, all of a sudden, Rome was Catholic. And it never fell. It was taken over by the Catholic faith. So the prophecy of Daniel still stands, that it's the last great civilization, and that the Western civilization, Europe, is just a continuation of Rome, broken down into 10 heads, and that will continue. And so that this is just another example of this way of how sacred Scripture, which covers everything, is right. But in any case, well, I want to go here with the Father, and we want to have a little question and answer thing here, and also just kind of a general discussion. And I think here we don't need to. We don't need to worry about the camera thing. We'll just talk, and then we'll go on for a while, you know. And so I don't know what you know here. And Father, where's Father? Did you find his siesta? But so you but well, there he is. Siesta.